A routine stop that was anything but. Rain danced lightly on the windshield as Marcus Cole navigated his way home after another marathon day in the office. The dim glow of streetlights reflected off the slick pavement, creating a kaleidoscope of colors on the deserted streets of Willow Creek. Marcus loved the quiet serenity of late-night drives, a stark contrast to the controlled chaos of his job as a civil rights attorney. Tonight, however, there was an eerie weight in the air, a sensation that prickled at his instincts. He wasn't wrong. The unmistakable red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror, shattering the peaceful monotony. His stomach sank, not out of guilt but out of the predictable dread that came with encounters like these. Marcus pulled over to the side of the road, the hum of the cruiser growing louder as it stopped directly behind him. He kept his hands firmly on the wheel at 10 and 2, taking steady breaths. Experience had taught him that even the slightest misstep could be construed as a threat. The officer approached with slow, deliberate steps, his boots crunching against the wet pavement. Marcus watched him in the side mirror, a tall man with a chiseled jawline and a uniform pressed so meticulously it looked as though he'd ironed it moments before stepping out. The man's demeanor screamed authority, but there was something else, an arrogance that Marcus recognized all too well. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice devoid of pleasantries. Marcus nodded politely and responded, "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer tilted his head, squinting at Marcus as though trying to size him up. "You were driving suspiciously slow," he said, the words dripping with condescension. Marcus blinked. Suspiciously slow. That was a new one. "It's raining," he replied evenly. "I was just being cautious." The officer leaned closer to the open window, his face inches away from Marcus. The smell of cheap coffee and stale tobacco lingered on his breath. "Careful, huh? Got something to hide?" Here it comes, Marcus thought. The thinly veiled insinuations, the casual antagonism. He'd seen it all before. Still, he maintained his composure. "No, officer. Everything is in order." He reached for the glove compartment, moving deliberately slow to avoid any misunderstanding. His license and registration were handed over without a fuss, but the officer snatched them away like Marcus had offered contraband. Without another word, the officer stomped back to his cruiser, leaving Marcus to sit alone in the rain-soaked silence. As the officer ran his information, Marcus's mind wandered. He thought about his mother's warnings when he first started driving. "Always be polite," she'd said. "Never give them a reason." Yet here he was, pulled over for nothing more than existing while black. His profession hadn't shielded him from profiling, but he'd learned to use moments like these to his advantage. Tonight, he felt that strange sensation again. Something was off. The officer returned, his face a mask of irritation. He handed back the documents with a grunt. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus frowned. "May I ask why, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his voice rising. Marcus inhaled deeply. It wasn't worth escalating. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped into the drizzle. The chill immediately seeped into his jacket as he faced the officer. The man towered over him, his posture designed to intimidate. "Pop the trunk," the officer demanded, gesturing sharply. Marcus crossed his arms. "With all due respect, officer, you need a warrant for that." The man's lips curled into a smirk. "That's where you're wrong. I can check whatever I damn well please." "No, you can't," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "You're violating my rights." The officer ignored him, walking toward the back of the car. Marcus followed, his fists clenching at his sides. He could hear his mother's voice again, warning him to keep his cool. But this was a line too far. The officer fumbled with his keys, muttering something under his breath. Marcus opened his mouth to protest again, but the trunk popped open before he could finish. The officer shone his flashlight into the trunk, revealing nothing more than a gym bag and a sleek gray document case tucked neatly in the corner. "What's this?" the officer asked, his tone shifting to suspicion as he picked up the case. "It's personal property," Marcus replied sharply. "You have no right to." The officer ignored him, unbuckling the latches on the case with unnerving eagerness. Marcus's heart thumped loudly in his chest, not out of fear, but anticipation. He knew exactly what was inside. The officer opened the case, and his expression froze. The confident smirk melted from his face, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed stare. His hands trembled as he held the document inside closer to his face, scanning its contents. "You've made a mistake," Marcus said calmly, watching the color drain from the officer's face. "A very big mistake." The officer's lips moved as if trying to form words, but no sound came out. He looked at Marcus, then back at the document. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the cold drizzle. You're, the officer stammered. "That's right," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Now, would you like to explain why you just violated the rights of the new regional director for civil oversight?" The officer staggered backward, the document still clutched in his trembling hands. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time, Marcus saw fear in the man's eyes. "Let's talk about your future," Marcus said, taking a step closer, "because it's not looking very bright right now." The rain continued to fall as the officer stood frozen, caught in the trap of his own arrogance. For Marcus, this was only the beginning. The predator becomes the prey. Officer Hendrick stood frozen in the rain, the gray document case still clutched in his hands. His once smug expression had collapsed into one of disbelief, panic flickering in his eyes. The wetness dripping from the brim of his hat was no longer just rain. Beads of sweat traced down his face as the weight of what he had just uncovered began to settle. Marcus folded his arms, watching the officer's internal struggle unfold like a play he had seen too many times before. "What's the matter, officer?" he asked, his tone sharp yet calm. "Did you find something enlightening?" Hendrick opened his mouth, but no words came. The document was undeniable. A direct order from the state's Attorney General's office naming Marcus Cole as the newly appointed Director of Civil Oversight for Law Enforcement, complete with the authority to investigate and discipline officers for misconduct. And there, bold as day, was Hendrick's name, underlined in red, as one of the officers currently under review for multiple complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. Marcus stepped forward, the rain splashing beneath his polished shoes. "I think it's time we had a little chat about your conduct, Officer Hendrick," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Wouldn't you agree?" The officer took an instinctive step back, the case dropping from his hands and landing with a dull thud in the trunk. He stammered, I didn't mean. "Didn't mean to what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Didn't mean to violate my rights. Didn't mean to open my trunk without a warrant, or didn't mean to harass a black man for simply driving home." Hendrick's face flushed, his earlier bravado replaced with a flustered defensiveness. "You were driving suspiciously," he mumbled, his voice lacking the sharp edge it held before. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Suspiciously slow in the rain. That's your justification?" He shook his head, his disappointment evident. "You thought this was going to be just another routine stop, didn't you? A chance to flex your authority, throw around some intimidation, maybe even escalate things if I didn't comply quickly enough." The officer's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Save it," Marcus snapped. "Let me tell you something, Officer Hendrick. Men like you are the reason I do what I do. You think your badge is a shield that protects you from accountability, but you've got it all wrong. That badge isn't a license to harass, intimidate, or discriminate. It's a responsibility, a duty to serve and protect all citizens, not just the ones you deem acceptable." The rain intensified, a steady rhythm pounding against the car and the ground around them. Hendrick's hands fidgeted at his sides as he struggled to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. "I didn't mean any harm," Hendrick said weakly, his voice barely audible over the rain. Marcus took another step closer, his presence commanding. "Didn't mean any harm. Do you have any idea what harm you could cause tonight? How many lives have you disrupted with stops like this? How many people have walked away from encounters with you feeling less human than they did before?" The officer's gaze dropped to the ground, shame starting to seep through his tough exterior. Marcus wasn't finished. "I spent years fighting for people who didn't have the power to stand up to men like you," Marcus said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Tonight, you messed with the wrong man. But instead of trying to save face, maybe you should take a long, hard look at yourself. Ask why you felt the need to pull me over in the first place." Hendrik finally met Marcus's eyes, his voice trembling as he spoke. "It was just a mistake. I didn't know who you were." Marcus let out a humorless laugh. "Exactly. You didn't know. And that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't know who I was, so you thought it was okay to treat me like a suspect without cause. Would you have done the same to someone who looked like you? Or was it my skin color that made me suspicious?" The officer opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus raised a hand to stop him. "Don't bother denying it. I see it every day in my work. And you know what? I'm tired. I'm tired of watching people like you abuse the authority you've been given. Tired of seeing families torn apart because of your ego. Tired of being the one who has to clean up your messes." The rain poured down harder, soaking through both men's clothes as silence hung heavily between them. Finally, Marcus stepped back, giving Hendrik just enough space to breathe. He pointed to the open document case in the trunk. "That file. It's part of an ongoing investigation into misconduct in this department. You've been on our radar for months, Hendrik. Tonight's little performance just added fuel to the fire." Hendrik's eyes widened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "You don't understand. If I lose this job..." Marcus's expression hardened. "If you lose this job, it's because of your own actions, not mine. Don't come to me looking for sympathy when you've spent your career making others feel powerless." Hendrik looked as though he might crumble under the weight of Marcus's words. But before he could respond, another set of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the downpour. A second police cruiser pulled up alongside them, and a younger officer stepped out, his face filled with confusion as he took in the scene. "Everything okay here, Officer Hendrik?" the new arrival asked, his voice cautious. Marcus stepped forward before Hendrik could answer. "Actually, no," he said, his tone professional. "Your colleague here violated several laws tonight, including unlawfully searching my vehicle. I suggest you call your supervisor. We'll need to sort this out immediately." The younger officer's eyes darted between Marcus and Hendrik, clearly unsure of what to do. Hendrik looked like he might protest, but Marcus's piercing gaze silenced him. "I'm not leaving until this is resolved," Marcus said firmly. "And trust me, I have all night." As the younger officer radioed for a supervisor, Marcus turned back to Hendrik, his voice low but resolute. "You're going to remember this night for the rest of your life. The question is, what are you going to do with that memory? Will it be the moment you finally change? Or just another excuse to blame someone else for your mistakes?" Hendrik said nothing, his head bowed as the rain continued to pour. For Marcus, this wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about challenging a broken system, and tonight, he had taken another step toward dismantling it, one piece at a time. The system starts to tremble. The second cruiser's red and blue lights flashed in sharp contrast against the dark, rainy night. Marcus stood tall, his soaked coat clinging to his frame as he watched the younger officer nervously fumble with his radio. Every movement of the new arrival was tentative, as though he were stepping into a minefield without a map. Marcus could see the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't a situation he'd been trained to handle. Officer Hendrik, however, looked like a man teetering on the edge of a cliff. His face, pale and tight with fear, had lost all traces of the arrogant bravado he'd displayed earlier. He kept glancing between Marcus and the approaching officer like a cornered animal searching for an escape route. Officer Hendrick, Marcus said, his voice calm but unyielding. You can avoid digging yourself into a deeper hole if you start telling the truth. Right now. The younger officer, badge glinting in the headlights, stepped closer, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. What's going on here? He asked, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the tension. Marcus turned to him, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze. What's going on is that your colleague here unlawfully detained me, violated my rights by searching my vehicle without cause, and in the process, discovered something that's making him regret every choice he's made tonight. The younger officer blinked, clearly taken aback. His eyes darted to Hendrick, who shifted uncomfortably, his wet hands still trembling. Officer Hendrick, the young man asked hesitantly, is this true? Hendrick opened his mouth, his lips trembling as he struggled to form a coherent response. I was just... Marcus cut in, his tone sharp. He was just abusing his authority. And if you don't step up right now, you'll be complicit in his actions. The younger officer straightened slightly, the words striking a nerve. Sir, I need you to remain calm while we sort this out, he said to Marcus, trying to regain control of the situation. Marcus let out a humorless laugh. Calm. Oh, I'm plenty calm. But I don't think you fully grasp the gravity of what's happening here. He pointed to the open trunk, where the gray document case sat ominously in the rain. Inside that case is proof that your colleague is under investigation for multiple allegations of misconduct. Tonight, he confirmed every single one of them. The younger officer's face turned ashen. What kind of allegations? Marcus didn't miss a beat. Excessive force, racial profiling, misuse of authority, and now, unlawful search and detainment. Hendrick finally found his voice, though it was weak and unconvincing. It's not what it looks like. I thought he was acting suspiciously. Marcus turned to him, his expression icy. Suspiciously. Driving home in the rain is suspicious now. Or was it the color of my skin that caught your attention? The younger officer's brow furrowed. He took a step closer to Hendrick, his voice low but firm. Is this true? Did you search his car without a warrant? Hendrick stammered, the words tumbling out in fragments. I thought. It's not like that. I just... Enough, Marcus interjected, his voice carrying the authority of a judge rendering a verdict. You thought you could get away with it. You thought this would be just another routine stop where you flex your power and intimidate someone who can't fight back. But tonight, you messed with the wrong person. The younger officer seemed torn, his loyalty to his colleague warring with his sense of duty. Before he could respond, a third set of lights appeared in the distance. The supervisor had arrived. The black SUV rolled to a stop behind the second cruiser, its headlights slicing through the rain. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a raincoat stepped out, his badge gleaming on his chest. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, his face a mask of professionalism that barely concealed his irritation at being called out in the middle of the night. Sergeant Daniels, the younger officer said quickly, walking to meet him. We've got a situation here. Daniels nodded curtly, his gaze shifting to Hendrick, who stood stiffly by the open trunk, and then to Marcus, who met his eyes without flinching. I see that, he said, his deep voice carrying over the rain. Someone start explaining. Marcus took the initiative, stepping forward. Sergeant Daniels, I'm Marcus Cole, newly appointed Director of Civil Oversight for Law Enforcement. Tonight, I was unlawfully stopped and detained by Officer Hendrick here, who proceeded to search my vehicle without a warrant or probable cause. He violated multiple laws and my constitutional rights. Daniel's expression darkened, and his gaze snapped to Hendrick. Is this true? Hendrick hesitated, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the accusation. I thought he was acting suspiciously, he mumbled, his earlier confidence now completely eroded. Daniel's jaw tightened. Suspiciously how? Was he speeding? Driving erratically? No, Hendrick admitted, his voice barely audible. He was driving slow. Daniels let out a slow, measured breath, the kind that signaled his patience was wearing thin. "And you thought that justified a search without a warrant?" I didn't know who he was," Hendrik said weakly, as though that excused his behavior. Daniels turned to Marcus, his tone apologetic. "Mr. Cole, I'd like to formally apologize for the actions of my officer. Rest assured, this will be investigated thoroughly." Marcus nodded but didn't back down. "An apology is a start, Sergeant, but it's not enough. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, a culture that allows officers like Hendrik to operate without accountability. That ends tonight." Daniel's face hardened, but he didn't argue. "I understand. We'll handle this internally." Marcus crossed his arms. "No, you won't. This department has a history of sweeping misconduct under the rug. That's why my office exists. Starting tomorrow, there will be a full review of every complaint filed against Officer Hendrik and any others who have followed his lead." The sergeant's lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't used to being challenged, but Marcus wasn't giving him a choice. "And for tonight," Marcus continued, his voice steady, "I expect Hendrik to be suspended immediately, pending the results of the investigation." Daniels glanced at Hendrik, who looked like he might collapse under the weight of his own fear. After a tense moment, the sergeant nodded. "Consider it done." As Hendrik was escorted to the second cruiser, his head hung low, Marcus allowed himself a small breath of relief. But he knew this was only the beginning. The real work would start tomorrow, exposing the rot within the system and holding those responsible accountable. The younger officer lingered for a moment, his face filled with uncertainty. "Sir," he said to Marcus, his voice hesitant, "I didn't know about any of this. I just want to do my job." Marcus regarded him carefully. "Then do it right," he said. "Serve and protect, not your ego, but the people who depend on you. And if you see something wrong, don't look the other way. Speak up." The officer nodded, his expression thoughtful as he returned to his cruiser. Marcus closed the trunk of his car, the gray document case safely back in its place. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the police vehicles pulled away one by one. The rain had begun to let up, but the storm within the system had only just begun. Marcus knew he'd have to weather it, but for the first time that night, he felt a sense of purpose rekindled. He started the engine and drove away, the quiet hum of the car a stark contrast to the chaos he was leaving behind. The fight was far from over, but Marcus was ready. Tonight had been a battle, but tomorrow would be the war. Behind the curtain of corruption, Marcus sat in his home office late into the night, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. The rain that had followed him home tapped lightly against the window, a rhythmic reminder of the storm he had just navigated. The gray document case sat on the desk before him, now more a symbol of the challenges ahead than the contents it held. Opening the case, Marcus scanned the documents inside once more. Names, dates, and details filled the pages, evidence of a deeply rooted culture of abuse and misconduct within the police department. At the top of the list was Officer Hendrik, whose name appeared next to a disturbing number of allegations: excessive force, racial profiling, unlawful detainment. And those were just the official complaints. Marcus knew that for every report filed, there were likely dozens of stories untold, hidden behind fear and resignation. Tonight's confrontation was a turning point, not just for Hendrik, but for Marcus. For years, he had fought these battles in courtrooms and boardrooms, wielding the law as his weapon. But this time, it was personal. This time, he wasn't just advocating for a client. He was standing up for himself, for his rights, and for everyone who had ever been silenced by a badge and a gun. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced. How many more officers like Hendrik were out there? How many more people were suffering under the weight of unchecked authority? The thought was overwhelming, but Marcus knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stop now. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the Office of Civil Oversight earlier than usual. The building was a stark, modern structure in the heart of the city, its clean lines and glass facade a sharp contrast to the gritty reality it sought to address. Marcus's assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Rachel, greeted him at the door with a fresh cup of coffee and a stack of files. "Rough night?" she asked, her keen eyes taking in the slight bags under his. "You could say that," Marcus replied, taking the coffee with a grateful nod. "But it was also a wake-up call. We've got work to do." Rachel followed him into his office, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I pulled the records you requested on Officer Hendrick," she said, setting the files down on his desk. "It's worse than we thought." Marcus raised an eyebrow, opening the top file. The contents confirmed what he had suspected. Hendrick's history was riddled with complaints, but very few had resulted in disciplinary action. Most had been dismissed, and the few that had led to internal reviews ended with minor reprimands, slaps on the wrist that did little to deter his behavior. "Unbelievable," Marcus muttered, flipping through the pages. "This isn't incompetence, it's deliberate." Rachel nodded. "The system is designed to protect them. Even when there's overwhelming evidence, they find ways to bury it. And Hendrick isn't the only one. He's just the tip of the iceberg." Marcus set the file down, his jaw tightening. "Not anymore. Starting today, we're going to pull back the curtain. I want a full audit of every officer in that department. Complaints, reviews, settlements, everything." Rachel hesitated. "That's going to ruffle some feathers. Are you sure you want to go all in this soon?" Marcus met her gaze, his voice firm. "This isn't just about Hendrick. It's about a culture that allows people like him to thrive. If we don't take action now, nothing will change." Rachel nodded, her respect for Marcus evident in her expression. "Understood. I'll get the team on it." As the day unfolded, the Office of Civil Oversight buzzed with activity. Marcus and his team pored over files, uncovering a pattern of negligence and complicity that stretched back years. It was like peeling back layers of rot, each revelation more damning than the last. By mid-afternoon, Marcus was on his third cup of coffee when his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but something told him to answer. "This is Marcus Cole," he said. "Mr. Cole, this is Sergeant Daniels," came the voice on the other end. "I thought you should know. Things are heating up on our end. Hendrick's suspension has sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers aren't happy." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "Good. They should be uncomfortable." Daniels hesitated. "Look, I don't agree with what Hendrick did, but this is going to be a long fight. The union's already pushing back, claiming his suspension was unjustified. They're threatening legal action." "Let them," Marcus replied without hesitation. "If they want to defend a man with his record, they're only exposing themselves. This isn't about one officer, Sergeant. It's about accountability." Daniels sighed. "I get that, but not everyone sees it that way. Some of these guys see you as the enemy." "I'm not the enemy," Marcus said firmly. "I'm just holding up a mirror. If they don't like what they see, that's on them." By the end of the day, Marcus's team had compiled a comprehensive report detailing the extent of misconduct within the department. The evidence was staggering, enough to justify not only Hendrick's suspension, but a full-scale investigation into the department's practices. As Marcus reviewed the report in his office, Rachel appeared in the doorway, her expression serious. "You've got a visitor," she said. "Who is it?" Marcus asked, setting the file aside. Rachel hesitated. "It's Hendrick." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Send him in." Hendrick entered the office cautiously, his posture tense and his face drawn. Gone was the cocky arrogance from the night before. In its place was a man who looked like he had aged 10 years in a matter of hours. "Mr. Cole," Hendrick began, his voice strained. I wanted to apologize." Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Hendrick obeyed, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Look, I know I messed up. I wasn't thinking straight last night. I let my biases get the better of me, and I crossed a line." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "A line? You didn't just cross a line, Officer Hendrick. You shattered it. And the worst part, this isn't the first time. You've been doing this for years, haven't you?" Hendrick's face crumpled. I don't know what to say. I never thought it would get to this point." "That's the problem," Marcus said. "You never thought. You just acted without regard for the people you were supposed to serve, and now you're here because you're scared of the consequences, not because you've changed." Hendrick's eyes filled with something resembling regret. "What can I do? How do I fix this?" Marcus considered him for a long moment. "You start by owning up to your actions, all of them. Not just to me, but to the people you've wronged. Then, if you're truly serious about change, you help us expose the system that allowed this to happen." Hendrick swallowed hard. "You're asking me to turn against my own." "I'm asking you to do the right thing," Marcus corrected. "But make no mistake, Officer Hendrick. If you choose to protect this broken system, you'll face the full weight of accountability." The room was silent for a long moment, the tension palpable. Finally, Hendrick nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Marcus leaned back, his expression unreadable. "We'll see." As Hendrick left the office, Marcus stared out the window, the city lights glowing against the darkening sky. The battle ahead would be long and grueling, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming. And it started here, cracking the system. The air in the office was tense the next morning. The coffee machines hummed, and keyboards clattered as Marcus and his team prepared for a crucial meeting. The comprehensive report on the police department's misconduct was ready to be presented to the state attorney general. The document, a culmination of long hours and relentless digging, was now their most powerful weapon in the fight against systemic injustice. Marcus scanned the room. His team, a diverse group of legal experts and investigators, sat around the table, their expressions a mix of determination and anticipation. Rachel stood by the projector, ready to present the key findings. The stakes were high, but so was their resolve. "All right," Marcus began, his voice steady. "We've got one shot at this. The Attorney General needs to see not just the extent of the problem, but the urgency of addressing it. Rachel, walk us through the key points." Rachel nodded, flipping through the slides. The report highlights a pattern of misconduct across multiple officers, with Officer Hendrick as a case study. Over the past 5 years, there have been 137 complaints filed against this department, 82 of which were dismissed without investigation. The remaining cases resulted in minor disciplinary actions, even when evidence supported more severe consequences. The room was silent as Rachel continued, her voice unwavering. "We've also identified systemic failures in oversight. Internal investigations are routinely conducted by officers with close ties to the accused, leading to clear conflicts of interest. Additionally, we found evidence suggesting that some complaints were intentionally misclassified to avoid scrutiny." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And the financial side?" Rachel pulled up a chart. Over $3.2 million has been paid out in settlements to victims of police misconduct. This doesn't include cases where victims couldn't afford legal representation or were intimidated into silence. The figures hit the room like a punch. Marcus felt a wave of anger rising within him, not just at the officers who had perpetrated these acts, but at the system that allowed them to flourish. "This isn't just negligence," he said, his voice hard. "It's corruption." Later that afternoon, Marcus walked into the grand conference room of the state attorney general's office. The room was stark, with its high ceilings and polished wooden table that seemed to stretch for miles. Seated at the head was Attorney General Susan Carter, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper intellect. She had built a reputation for being tough but fair, and Marcus knew she would be a critical ally, or a formidable obstacle. "Mr. Cole," Carter greeted, extending a hand. "I've heard quite a bit about you." "Thank you for taking the time, Madam Attorney General," Marcus replied, shaking her hand firmly. "I believe we have some urgent matters to discuss." Carter gestured for him to sit, and Marcus wasted no time diving into the details. As he laid out the findings of the report, Carter's expression remained unreadable, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "This is damning evidence," Carter said finally, her tone measured. "But taking on an entire department will be challenging." "I'm not asking for an easy road," Marcus replied. "I'm asking for justice. If we let this slide, it sends a message that accountability doesn't apply to those in uniform. We can't afford that, not as a society." Carter leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the table. "You're right, of course, but this will require more than a report. We need witnesses, testimonies, concrete proof that can hold up in court." Marcus nodded. "I've already started building that case. I believe Officer Hendrick could be a key witness. He's agreed to cooperate." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Hendrick? The same officer who's at the center of this mess?" "Yes," Marcus said. "He's seen the writing on the wall. He knows his career is over unless he comes clean. And if we play this right, his testimony could expose the network protecting these officers." Carter considered this for a moment before nodding. "All right. I'll authorize a task force to assist you. But be warned, this won't be easy. The police union will fight tooth and nail to protect their own." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Marcus replied. "But we're ready." The following week was a whirlwind of activity. With the Attorney General's backing, Marcus's team expanded their investigation, poring over case files, interviewing witnesses, and gathering evidence. Hendrick's cooperation proved invaluable. Though his testimony was reluctant at first, it soon became clear that he knew more than anyone had anticipated. One evening, Marcus sat with Hendrick in a sterile conference room. The former officer looked more subdued than ever, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "You need to be honest with me," Marcus said, his tone firm but not unkind. "If we're going to take this to court, we need every detail. No half-truths, no omissions." Hendrick nodded, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "There's a lot I'm not proud of," he admitted. "But there were things I couldn't say no to. Orders from higher-ups. Quotas to meet. If you didn't fall in line, you became a target yourself." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Are you saying this goes beyond the officers on the ground?" Hendrick hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. The captain, some of the lieutenants. They all knew. They encouraged it, even. Said it was how we kept control." Marcus leaned back, absorbing the revelation. This wasn't just about individual misconduct. It was a systemic problem, orchestrated from the top. And now he had a chance to expose it. As the case gained traction, it began to draw attention from the media. Headlines splashed across newspapers and online outlets. "Civil rights attorney takes on corrupt police department." "Officer turned whistleblower exposes systemic abuse." And "Justice for victims." "Oversight office targets police misconduct." With the public now watching closely, the pressure on Marcus and his team intensified. But it also brought hope. Victims who had previously stayed silent began to come forward, sharing their stories and adding their voices to the growing call for accountability. One evening, Marcus met with a young man named Darnell, who had been brutally assaulted by Hendrick during a traffic stop 3 years earlier. Darnell's case had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence, but his story was heart-wrenching. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," Darnell said, his voice shaking. "But now, seeing what you're doing, it gives me hope." Marcus reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Darnell's. "Your story matters, and we're going to make sure the world hears it." By the end of the week, Marcus's office was a hive of activity, buzzing with the energy of a team on the verge of making history. The walls were lined with evidence boards, connecting dots and weaving a narrative that was impossible to ignore. As Marcus looked around, a sense of pride swelled in his chest. This wasn't just a legal battle, It was a fight for justice, for dignity, for the soul of the community. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like they might actually win. Justice at the tipping point. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, their eyes fixed on the witness stand where Officer Hendrick sat, his hands folded tightly on the table in front of him. The once confident officer now looked pale and exhausted, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "I didn't think about the consequences back then," Hendrick admitted, his gaze avoiding the piercing stares of the jury. I thought it was just how things were done. But looking back, I can see the harm I caused. And for that, I'm sorry." Marcus Cole sat at the prosecution's table, his pen poised over a notepad, though he wasn't writing anything. His focus was entirely on the unfolding testimony. Hendrick had been a gamble, a reluctant whistleblower turned key witness. And now, his words were bringing to light the systemic corruption that had plagued the department for years. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Officer Hendrick, you mentioned earlier that certain practices were encouraged by your superiors. Can you elaborate on that?" Hendrick swallowed hard. "It started with quotas," he said. "We were expected to hit certain numbers for stops, arrests, citations, things like that. The captain called it maintaining order, but really it was about revenue and control. If someone looked like they didn't belong, we were told to investigate. And didn't belong usually meant black or brown." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Hendrick continued, his voice heavier now. "They told us to escalate situations when we could," he added. "Said it made us look tougher, more in control. And if anyone filed a complaint, we were told not to worry. The department had our backs." In the gallery, Marcus spotted Darnell sitting with his family, their faces a mix of hope and tension. Darnell's case had been a cornerstone of Marcus's strategy, a stark, undeniable example of how the system had failed to protect its citizens. Hearing Hendrick's confession must have felt vindicating, but Marcus knew it wouldn't erase the scars. The prosecutor pressed on. "You mentioned that your captain encouraged these practices. Can you identify specific instances or provide evidence to support this claim?" Hendrick hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "There were meetings," he said finally, "not official ones. They'd call us into the back room. No recordings, no notes. They'd say things like, 'Make sure they know who's in charge.' I didn't keep any records, but it was understood." The prosecutor nodded, glancing at Marcus. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a start. Marcus had spent weeks building a case that went beyond Hendrick's testimony. And now, all those threads were coming together. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Protesters held signs demanding justice, their voices echoing down the city streets. News cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the trial to an audience eager for accountability. Marcus stepped outside during a brief recess, the crisp autumn air a welcome relief from the courtroom's intensity. A reporter approached him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Cole, do you believe today's testimony will lead to meaningful change?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "It's a step in the right direction," he said, "but real change doesn't come from one trial. It comes from dismantling the systems that allow abuse to thrive. That's what we're fighting for." The reporter nodded, jotting down notes. "And what would you say to those who argue that this trial is creating division rather than unity?" Marcus's eyes hardened. Accountability isn't divisive, it's necessary. If we want a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, we have to confront the uncomfortable truths. Ignoring them only perpetuates the cycle. Back inside, the trial resumed. The defense attorney, a seasoned litigator hired by the police union, approached the stand. His demeanor was calm, almost condescending, as he began his cross-examination of Hendrick. "Officer Hendrick," the defense attorney began, "you claim that you were following orders. Are you suggesting that you bear no responsibility for your actions?" Hendrick shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. "No, I'm not saying that. I take responsibility for what I did. But the culture, It pushed us to act a certain way. The attorney pounced. Ah, so it's the culture that's to blame. Convenient, isn't it, to point fingers at an abstract idea rather than owning up to your decisions. Marcus clenched his jaw. The defense was predictable. Deflect, diminish, and distract. But Hendrik surprised him by sitting up straighter, his voice steady for the first time. "I'm not blaming the culture to avoid responsibility," Hendrik said firmly. "I'm pointing it out because it's the reason officers like me felt justified in what we were doing. If we don't address that culture, this will keep happening." The courtroom fell silent, the defense attorney momentarily thrown off balance. Marcus allowed himself a small nod of approval. Hendrik was finally stepping up. The trial stretched on for several more days, with witnesses from both sides painting a stark picture of a deeply flawed system. Victims shared stories of humiliation and fear, while officers defended their actions as necessary for public safety. The contrast was stark, the stakes impossibly high. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. Marcus sat at the prosecution's table, his heart pounding as the lead prosecutor delivered a powerful summation. "This case isn't about one officer," she said, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "It's about a system that allowed abuse to flourish, a system that prioritized power over people. Officer Hendrik's testimony has shown us how deep this problem runs. Now it's up to us to decide whether we'll continue to look the other way or take a stand for justice." That evening, Marcus returned to his office, exhausted but hopeful. The jury would deliberate tomorrow, and their decision could set a precedent for cases like this across the country. As he sat at his desk, he opened a letter from Darnell, written in careful, uneven handwriting. "Mr. Cole," it read, "thank you for believing in me when no one else did. No matter what happens, I'll never forget what you've done." Marcus set the letter down, his throat tight with emotion. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. Tomorrow would bring the verdict, but tonight, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about proving that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And for Marcus, that was worth everything.